All right. I think we're going to go ahead and get started. So, welcome to the Dean's Diversity Lecture. This is very exciting. This is the first in-person Dean's Diversity Lecture we've had since the pandemic, and I think it's the first hybrid. Someone can tell me if I'm wrong. It's the first hybrid Dean's Diversity Lecture. And so, excited to have Provost Raver here, but we'll get to that in a second. So the Dean's Diversity Lecture is a forum designed to host frank and open discussions about race, diversity, and inclusion. Nationally recognized speakers are invited to share their thoughts and create spaces for dialogue with members of the Peabody community. Dean Bimbo, with the help of the Peabody Faculty Council EDI Committee, selects speakers to share their experience, research, and perspectives with Peabody. So you may have noticed that I am not the dean. We look very similar. People mistake us all the time. So unfortunately, Dean Bimbo is sick and she has the flu. I got a call from her this afternoon and she truly sounded really terrible. So I told her to get back into bed and watch the talk on YouTube with lots of other folks online. And she wants to express her sincere regrets for not being able to be here. She really did want to be here. In order of business, before we get started, I'm going to introduce Nicole Joseph, Dr. Nicole Joseph, to come up here in just a second. Nicole Joseph is an associate professor of mathematics education in the Department of Teaching and Learning. Her research explores Black women and girls' experiences and identities in math and how their underrepresentation in the field is shaped by whiteness and white supremacy. She's the author of numerous peer-reviewed articles and a forthcoming book, Mathematizing Feminism. That's the wrong title?
It's called Making Mathematics Education, Making Black Girls Count in Math Education.
All right, I knew she was going to call me out if I got something wrong. So, as a passionate advocate for Black women and girls in STEM, Nicole is the founder of the Intersectional Study of Black Women and Girls in Society and the organizer of the annual Tennessee March for Black Women in STEM. And over the summers, she has worked on conducting the Black Girls Becoming Summer Research Institute in collaboration with Black women faculty across the university. This is a 2-week institute hosting rising 7th and 8th grade girls for a residential campus living and learning experience, and we've only heard great things about this program. She's really done the university proud. Nicole has received several honors for her research, the Chancellor's Award for Research in EDI, the Early Career Scholars of Color Award from the American Educational Research Association, and most recently, the Louise Hay Award from the Association for Women in Mathematics. Amazing, right? But the most important thing that I'm excited to announce today is that she is going to be the new Peabody Associate Dean for Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. Let's give her a hand. So Nicole, welcome.
So thank you for joining us this evening for our Dean's Diversity Lecture with Provost Raver. You can see tonight her title is Flipping the Script to Reverse a Situation, especially by doing something unexpected. Provost Raver is an esteemed psychologist whose research has addressed the impacts of poverty and policy on early learning and development. So I wanted to learn more about what that looked like, so I went and tried to find some reading and some articles. And one example of that is she designed and implemented the Chicago School Readiness Project, an intervention to improve the social and emotional well-being of low-resourced children who were enrolled in Head Start. So I went to Head Start, so I was feeling a connection with that. The cool thing is that many of the students, I couldn't find exact percentage, but many of these students continued into secondary education with more robust learning trajectories. Provost Raver is also an accomplished academic trailblazer. She has held several leadership roles, such as Deputy Provost of New York University, the Senior Vice Provost for Academic Analytics and Graduate Academic Affairs, and the inaugural Director of the Institute of Human Development and Social Change. So recently, she came and attended the Faculty of Color Connect program that Dwayne and I have put together, and she shared a lot about being a woman in a male-dominated field. And what she shared that really touched me was that it was important to really make visible the hidden curriculum of what's in these spaces, especially to be able to support underrepresented identities. Making the hidden curriculum visible is a critical component of making sure that we are mobilizing, supporting, and promoting a more equitable experience for all of the members here at Vanderbilt University. Finally, on a personal note, Provost Raver has supported me and my research, and one of those things was for the Black Girls Becoming. She gave me a shout out on one of her with her tweets, and it really touched me when I read it, and I want to read it to you. She says, "Fantastic interdisciplinary work by Dr. Joseph that spans social sciences, arts, STEM, and led to the founding of the inaugural Black Girls Becoming program. This is a path-breaking initiative that translates research into action and impact." And I just want to say that meant a lot to me, Provost Raver. So let's give her a welcome here at Peabody.
Thank you so much, Associate Dean. It's so exciting. And we really recognize the importance of this kind of event, and I really thank you for inviting me to be the person speaking at this event. And I really want to thank Dean Benbow and, of course, Dwayne for that introduction of Nicole. I love that passing along and lifting up of the celebration of our work together and of each of your leadership, and I think that's exactly what this talk is going to be about. So thanks, everyone, for being here. Today's talk is quite unusual for me. I usually give a very scholarly talk about my research, building on a lot of what Nicole mentioned I do. And so this is a new way of presenting my work and presenting my passion and my leadership. And I really welcome feedback, so we'll just get started. Today I'm going to talk about two values at Vanderbilt that I think we talk a lot about. One, belonging, that I think we often lift up as a really important value and that I certainly hold very close to my leadership and to my own personal values. But the other is courage, and I think we don't actually explore as much as we'd like that belonging and a sense of belonging, feeling one's own sense of belonging and building a sense of belonging actually takes courage. I'm going to talk a little bit about the ways in which all of us, you, belong here, right? You've worked incredibly hard, whether you're graduate students or undergraduates or faculty, to be here, and your being here is deserved and you belong here. But that said, the academy, university life, whether it's submitting papers for review or grants for review and funding or giving a talk or giving a lecture or giving a presentation in class, often involves critique, right? It's very much a question of being challenged and facing a sense of feeling that our perspectives might put us on the outside rather than on the inside track, so to speak. And then on top of that, I recognize from my own experience and for many of you in this room, particularly for those of you from marginalized or minoritized perspectives, that sense of being an outsider is even more heightened. So today I'm going to talk about flipping the script on that framing or that experience of being an outsider. So I'll start with my own biography, which I've never shown before in a talk in this way. That's me and my little sister in New York City growing up. We had a single mom growing up in a rent-controlled apartment on 96th and Madison, and we're experimenting. We are young scientists. We are blowing bubbles out the window. We are also playing, and we're having a good time. This is a safe way to play in New York City in the 1970s. And I transitioned through undergrad on financial aid as through also K-12, going to a really elite private school, also on financial aid, to end up successfully and extremely excitedly at Yale to train for my PhD. When I got there, I was a bit stunned to realize that I felt like an outsider because I had had an experience going to a single-sex school, growing up in an all-girl family. I was highly identified with my gender as a woman, but there were no women teaching quantitatively oriented courses for my training. And it turned out there were just not that many women, period, in the faculty. So you'll notice that Yale Provost William Brainerd set as a target to have 30 tenured women on the Yale faculty by 1990, and I was joining in 1989. Equally importantly, as an out gay woman, as a woman who identified as lesbian, it was really important to me that Yale sent a very clear signal that I was safe at Yale in terms of my own political and legal status. That was because at the time, sexual orientation was not included in most equal opportunity clauses. And when I look back now, I realized that actually Lawrence v. Texas, which gave individuals the right to privacy, including intimate sexual conduct with same-sex partners, was not a guarantee until 2003. Sodomy laws made illegal same-sex intimate contact and conduct up until that point, and was enforced as illegal in several states while I was a graduate student. So, you know, those meant that if I walked into a room and people weren't sure what to make of me, that was because I was experiencing outsider status, and the way in which I had to work to think about myself as an insider in that context, I'll talk about in just a second. Lastly, one that I think we talk about relatively rarely, but it came up in lunch today, and I loved hearing about the proactive steps that graduate students are taking for leadership in this space, was around first-gen status. Though my mom and dad had both completed college, graduate school was very much not part of their experience. Having been on financial aid, I did not have a parent who had a PhD, but I got to graduate school and several of my peers did have parents who were faculty. And I realized that this was also a part of private elite educational experience. So much so that even today, a third of our faculty in top-ranked universities grew up in households where at least one parent had a PhD. And I think we need to talk about and actually think through what we need to do and how we can support students whose first-gen status may make us feel like, or them feel like outsiders. So in those regards, how do we address that? Well, we also can think about being an outsider or an insider in terms of our own discipline and our intellectual inquiry. So I don't want to restrict this only to social address or underrepresented minoritized status. At the time, developmental psychology was really kind of at the intersection of a fight between those who felt that psychology should be a strong science with experimental paradigms and those who felt that it should be, quote unquote, softer. Of course, you hear the gendered language in that, more close to humanities that really was more about the phenomenology of life experience. And Yale, my own program, was deeply wedded to demonstrating the scientific rigor of our field, which was important. And Donald Hebb was someone that we spoke about and talked about all the time, which meant experimental conditions, as many of you know, often using rat animal models to test the way in which the brain, neurological development is plastic through deprivation of sensory experience, for example, to show how that affects perception. Well, that was great, except that it had nothing to do with my intellectual interests in the experience of children in terms of both their cognition and their affect, their emotion regulation, their emotional development, and it had nothing to do with my interest in families' lives in social and economic contexts. I came to graduate school specifically because I wanted to understand the experiences of and the development of resilience in children's lives, particularly for those children experiencing income inequality in their communities. That way in which the method meant that I felt that I didn't have clear guidelines on how to proceed as a scientist were challenging. And that was because many of the research faculty in our program were really bound to a nature versus nurture kind of debate with strong emphasis on what we called Volvo families, to basically drive out all possible confounds in the data by studying only one type of family and to treat that type of family as if the findings from that type of family could be generalized to everyone. And those were white middle-class families from the suburbs who were not experiencing single-parent status or low socioeconomic status or job loss or any of the things that I was really, really fascinated by and wanted to understand and had some life experience in. On the other hand, I recognized that I could find heroes outside of my field, and that is exactly what I was able to do by turning to incredibly important trailblazing and landmark scholars like William Julius Wilson, whose work in sociology was groundbreaking, particularly in countering deficit models of poverty. Lindsay Chase Lansdale, who was particularly interested in the role of neighborhood and family and policy, not just in child development qua children's own experience and sort of intra-psychic or intra-individual factors, and with a strong emphasis on resilience and not on deficit in the context of poverty and income inequality. And that was also to say that we found a huge number of very cool statistical methods emerging outside of the academy, occurring actually in fields of policy evaluation in corporate contexts like a company called MDRC or RAND or Mathematica, these research firms that were answering huge policy questions and being able to draw those statistical methods into the field. What's my point here? I think what I want to highlight is that my outsider status became a driving force for creativity and for hypothesis generation, so that I learned that because I was seeing something from a different perspective, that I could see it actually as a strength rather than see it as something that was wrong with me as a scholar or wrong with that part of our field. That meant that I had a harder road and a stronger set of cases that I had to make to reviewers, and that I had to pick myself up a lot more frequently after a lot more rejection. But I'm going to share now a couple of ways in which I really felt I had the opportunity to flip the script. Before I get there, I will just tell a little bit about what I did to do that. The first is that I started becoming very conscious about how I opened my talks. Anytime I gave a presentation, I tended to give this slide, and up until recently, I still gave this slide. Because of a couple of different features of this slide. This slide shows the rates of poverty in the United States from 1959 until relatively recently, till about 13 years ago. And you can see that the rate of poverty for children, the one with the giant magnetic dot bouncing through, starts at about 25%, and what do you notice happens? It drops, and then it climbs, and then it drops, and then it climbs, and then it drops, and then it climbs, and where does it land? It lands at about 20%, kind of close to where it started, right? So you notice that it hasn't changed much, and that about 1 in 5 children in the United States lives below the federal poverty threshold. So I would use this slide to be really clear. When I speak about children in poverty, I'm not speaking about some small, strange, odd community that feels completely peripheral to the questions of science and psychology. I'm talking about 1/5 of the US population, and that Volvo family paradigm cannot be necessarily generalized, but in fact, I should be able to talk about this sample and generalize from this sample from kids in poverty, just as another researcher might generalize from a less minoritized or economically disadvantaged community, right? So normalizing and placing in a more clearly blunt frame that my work is actually theoretically super strong, and that the implications of whatever I find are actually generalizable not to only a small quadrant of the universe, but actually something that we should all think about, right? The second thing I would point out is what else do you notice about this graph in terms of rates of poverty for people 65 and older? Huge drop, right? From 1959 to 2009. What explains this tremendous drop in poverty for older Americans? Social Security, a policy, right? And who advocated for that policy? Anybody want to talk about the history of policy for elderly in America? Anybody want to take a guess? Well, I've recently started getting a card from this group, the American Association of Retired Persons, advocating for people ages 55 or older, was formed in the 50s by a group of retired educators who lobbied strongly for the rights of the elderly to not be struggling in poverty. And for that reason, Social Security payments, which were originally called widows' pensions, were dramatically increased to lift families, elderly adults, out of poverty. And the reason that I would show that is to be able to highlight that poverty is not a natural state. Poverty, as whether I'm going to talk about policy in my talk, I want us to understand that in the context of poverty, we're going to have this discussion and debate about children's emotional development, but we should not treat poverty itself as something that we can't change, right? And the third reason I would show this slide is because I wanted to be super clear to you as an audience as I walk up to the podium that I am quantitatively sharp and confident, and that I have really a great deal to share with you in quantitative terms, but also to elicit from you in quantitative terms. I want to engage in collaboration and discussion that's really about a give and take, and that I can handle it, right? So what am I doing that for? Recently, a colleague named Lisa Coleman, who heads EDI at NYU, helped me to understand this as personal branding, that this is me essentially telling you how to see me because you may be uncertain about how to read who I am. And that is actually incredibly important, because if I don't do it for myself, I am assured that everyone will be doing it for me, whether I like it or not. And that form of self-presentation and declaration is really important. So what did I learn in those times, and then as I went forward as an assistant professor at Cornell and then an associate professor at University of Chicago? I first had to recognize that I was experiencing on a regular basis a feeling that I was being underestimated or misunderstood, and that I had to take that very much into my own hands. One was that I recognized that that made me furious, and that rather than walking out of the situation with my fury in hand and my righteous sense of, I can't believe you didn't understand this about me, that I had to take myself into a place of fearless competitor, seeing this as actually a playing field on which I really intended to compete and possibly win. And that helped me convert what I knew to be true about myself, which is that I'm a really hard worker and that I see situations in as fundamentally a positive light as I can, to really then see it as a competition in a friendly but super fierce way. And in doing that, really being able to figure out, well, what are the rules of play, right? What are the rules of engagement here? And how can I actually understand the playbook and actually make more transparent that playbook for myself, but also for my allies and for those who may come after me? How can I pass it forward? This sense of an implicit playbook, that there are somehow rules that are being played by, and that I didn't get that playbook upon walking in the door, was actually, I think, as a result of having peers who had parents who were PhD'd and my not having them, right? That was not something that was anybody's fault, but I was sure going to fix it. And the third was to really identify as many allies and colleagues and heroes as I possibly could, so that I could feel less alone in that, and so that I could actually serve to build a more brave space, rather than feeling like I had to hope for a safe space, and if I didn't encounter one, that I was stuck alone to navigate it. Here I just happen to show pictures of Allison Marks, who is the only female student in cognitive psychology at the time, Hiro Yoshikawa, who is out and gay at Harvard and who is a colleague because we were both mentored by the same mentor, and Bettina Jean-Louis, who as a Caribbean American was focusing on linguistics, and had an awesome experience leaving a university trajectory for working at Harlem Children's Zone as a key leader. And each of us ended up in different places in our careers, but we had tremendous amount of allyship in sharing that playbook, as well as just being able to sort of detox from the intensity of being outsiders in our own spaces, and also how to coach each other on getting through it. So in no way would this be something that we should have to do by ourselves, and it was important that I had a cohort that would really provide me with coaching and support. Not only I think it important for me to flip the script for myself, but then for me to think about flipping the script for the institution, right? That it's absolutely the case that institutional change is as important as individual acts or actions in that moment. This idea of creating the space as a brave space, so that if my friend Allison spoke up and contradicted the faculty member on something that was said or another peer, that I then reaffirmed what she said and built upon it, right? That we affirmed each other and expanded the opportunities for disagreement or for speaking up and speaking out. That we set the expectation of learning and collaboration and growth rather than beating one another out for a particular slot. That this was not going to be about sort of bloodying each other up metaphorically and coming out the victor, but rather learning and strengthening our ideas in that space of disagreement or contest. And this idea that in disagreeing, I was enacting my sense of belonging, that in speaking up or giving an alternate perspective or sharing a new hypothesis, I was enacting a form of belonging. Whether it was accorded to me, I was taking that space. I think that's really important. We sometimes don't know how to code disagreement, and I want us to understand disagreement in that way. That it's really about owning a claim and owning the space, and that practicing that requires support. Even today in our Office of Provost presentations, we practice and we give each other critique because we want to be able to confidently walk in the room and own this and claim this space. And that is an institutional commitment, not just an individual action. So just a little about my program of research. You can see that I focused extensively on children's self-regulation, both their cognitive regulation, how they focus their attention, and how they use their working memory, for example, and sequence and prioritize their behaviors, so in something called executive function, and their emotional self-regulation. How do they regulate their emotional arousal in a context that is stressful or anxiety-provoking? For example, how am I regulating the stress of giving a new kind of talk in front of a large audience, right? That would be the central basic developmental process that I was focusing on in the context of both family contexts and school contexts, with a strong emphasis as I was able to build out that program of research, not just on poverty, but also on policy, with a really clear window into the way in which neuroscience helps us to understand the toxic stressors impact on brain development, for example, and on our neurophysiology, how we respond in those situations that require our vigilance, but also thinking about prevention science, helping us to understand our policy options in reducing those stressors and supporting resilient and positive outcomes in the face of stress. My academic trajectory, I was mentioning at lunch, actually moved really quite rapidly. I expected to go to a postdoc, but ended up landing a tenure track job at Cornell, where I found that I loved building and mentoring a lab and mentoring PhD students. My favorite thing about my career was not just the writing and the analyzing of the data, but the building of the team and the mentoring and support that we gave to each other in doing that. And that led me to really expand my program of research to include randomized controlled trials of interventions, both to test the causal role of those mediating mechanisms of self-regulation, but also because it was so much fun to run a really large program and team and to be able to facilitate that kind of work. Some of my work was very much about describing the problem. What does the problem of poverty for children look like, and how do we understand financial hardship, for example? It turns out many, many more families above the poverty line also experience multiple forms of financial hardship, and I wanted to extend and expand our understanding of that and the roles of parent stress and positive parenting. I also wanted to expand our understanding of the kinds of stressors children face, including violent crime and gun violence in our communities. So that our leaders would understand why those issues of secure neighborhoods with well-lit and well-managed and well-funded housing would make a big difference for children. But my work also moved to solving the problem in the sense of being able to test the efficacy or the impact of specific interventions. And Nicole, thank you so much for mentioning the role of CSRP, the Chicago School Readiness Project, in supporting children's neurocognitive and self-regulatory functioning, but also their academic outcomes. And another project that I did with my colleague Clancy Blair, looking at a curriculum called Tools of the Mind that really supports teachers in being able to support children's executive function. In doing that, we were able to be part of a larger movement, I would argue, in the 80s and 90s and into the 2000s that really made clear the evidence that while we have a huge gap in academic achievement between the top quintile of the nation's young children in terms of SES and the bottom quintile, those families who are earning least and have least access to financial resource, that gap can be closed by 50%, by half, if children are given access to early childhood education of high quality. What's also really important is that the project I was able to do after this was partnering with New York City in its rapid expansion of pre-K. And what we found in that rapid expansion, where we went from, the city went to being able to provide slots for 70,000 children, free, high-quality slots, was that it not only benefited children's emotional and cognitive development, but it actually lifted families out of poverty, right? Because parents were then able to be more happier about the prospect of leaving their children in group care and could engage in paid work in a more stable and reliable way. So that takes me to this next stage that I'd like to talk a little bit about, which is serving as a leader of institutions, not just as a faculty member, though I think many faculty members are leaders in so many ways. There's something very specific about taking on the role of associate dean or associate provost or director or dean or vice provost or provost or chancellor. One of them is getting over our own internal biases about the word administrator, right? There's something about that feels like bureaucrat that just seems awful. And I had to understand that we could see those leadership roles as leadership, not as administrative roles only. I love administrators. I love being an administrator, but sometimes I know that I'm misunderstood or misperceived or, again, being viewed as an outsider because of that. And I had to flip the script in my own head about what a leader is or who a leader is, and I'll talk about that in just a second. But I was really good at getting stuff done. I was really good about finding and hiring and supervising talented people and being able to support their growth and being able to, hit our deliverables and manage a budget. And none of that struck me as leaderly. I just thought that was being really effective at getting stuff done. And it took a lot for me to back out of that and realize, no, that's actually really effective leadership. And I can think about perceiving myself and promoting myself as a leader rather than just as being really effective at getting stuff done. What kind of a leader am I? Putting more time into thinking about that, flipping the script on how I talk about myself. That's not something that many of us, particularly from minoritized or underrepresented communities, are comfortable doing, talking about ourselves and thinking about how we want to be seen. It's very aligned with what I said before about brand. This idea of getting it done, being an effective manager versus being a visionary. When I say the word visionary, I feel super uncomfortable. It seems like an overclaim, right? But I have some colleagues from, positions of more self-affirmed and world-affirmed positions who call themselves visionaries all the time. And I realize, what does that person get to do that I don't get to do because I don't claim it? And therefore, what can I start thinking about as a great idea that I should instead rebrand as a strategy? That kind of repositioning of my own ideas as visionary or as potentially visionary, I think is important and one that I would encourage everyone here to do. And then lastly, just introducing myself and recognizing that I still, even at this stage, have clutches that are internal that I have to work with and flip. So saying my name is Cybele Raver and I'm the provost made me feel initially, I can't even express, a sort of weird, cringy feeling, even though it was objectively and clearly totally true. I just moved from New York to be the provost, right? So clearly I had some work to do, and I needed to start finding a way to affirm my own cringy feeling while also pushing through it. And so by saying, I'm your provost, I could feel completely comfortable by saying, hi, my name is Cybele Raver, and I'm your provost. What does that communicate? I work for you, I represent you, I am accountable to you, and I actually really feel a strong affinity to you just by virtue of saying that, right? That's actually close to who I am and is much closer to where I want to communicate I would like to go. Institutionally, ditching the lone genius model is really important, so that it's really important that when I have the opportunity to recruit a new leader, my first questions are, what do you want to accomplish and what do you need to get that done? And not leaving it to that leader to ask me, to summon the courage to ask for the resource or to ask for the help, right? That is something that we all need. I cannot get things done well if I don't have resource to accomplish it. Investing the time in communication became really important. This is not true for academics. We tend to assume that we all speak the same language. I show you a table, I tell you how to read it, you all get it, you either believe me or you don't, but we are pretty much done in about a 7-minute time frame, right? And this is very different in a university leadership position, where I actually need to think actively about different stakeholders, different communities, different groups, constituencies, and how they're going to hear a message, and how many times I may need to reaffirm and reassert the message, and listen as much as I speak, right? That, while it's not true in this talk at this moment, is key to my leadership success, that I really, really think a lot about communication. And finally, endorsement, that a key feature of leadership, but particularly leadership, I think for me, coming in from a perspective of feeling occasionally as an outsider, is that sometimes I may recognize that what I've just said hasn't been heard by somebody else or by other people in the room. And this is very common, right, when we know that someone just said something, they might be from an underrepresented category, and everybody in the room did not notice or did not appear to notice that that person said that thing, and then someone from a more dominant position says the same thing from a more powerful position, and everyone turns to that person and says, great point, right? That is where actually endorsement of that first person's comment by the second person would flip the script. Right? And so there are times where I recognize I have to actively, strategically ask somebody else to endorse what I just said, or alternately, and both. I need to actively look for all the opportunities I can endorse and affirm what that person just said so that others hear it, right? And it's no one's fault, it's that it's sometimes hard to hear a message. There's a lot going on. We're cognitively managing a lot of new pieces of information. That endorsement can help immensely in really cementing that person's leadership. So who is a leader? I just spoke a little bit about who we perceive as a leader and who we want to perceive as a leader. Obviously, those that we see in leadership, we begin to frame our perceptions of who is a leader. Our national record of leadership in higher education among people of color, currently we're doing a pretty dismal job. So only 10% of college presidents are members who identify as members of communities of color. College presidents, women are 22%. Deans, 10%. You can see these numbers are just incredibly dismal, so much so that it's just like stressful to think about and see. That said, it commands me and commands everyone here to be deeply committed to being able to flip this script. At Vanderbilt, we are flipping this script. You can see that in our Office of Provost, 50% of our teams is made up of members who identify as members of communities of color and as women. You can see in terms of our deans, we are at 30 to 40%, and you can see all the way down through the line how different. Look at the tenured professors compared to where my origin story 30 years ago, right? That said, again, we have plenty of room to grow here, and we have lots that we can do in terms of our leadership. How are we going to do that? Well, we have an amazing team led by Tracy George, our Vice Provost of Faculty Affairs, with Cindy Kam and Liz Eichmeister, also supporting leadership, and Dwayne Watson. It's super exciting to have Dwayne's partnership in this, and all the ways that this is happening at the school level, as we just heard. So this way in which we can dramatically, substantially support and make visible the playbook for leadership. Why would you want to be a leader if you don't know what being a leader involves? How would you know if you're being successful as a leader? Why would you take the risk in terms of your reputation or putting in the time if you don't have that playbook? And that this is specifically about trying to outline and frame that discussion. And what do you get to do as a leader? Well, one of the things you get to do at this university, which I was so thrilled to find when I joined Vanderbilt, I was not as aware of this as I might have been or could be, is that we have you all to turn to for phenomenal work that you already do in diversifying the science, technology, engineering, math, and other disciplines, social sciences workforce by training the next generation of young scholars and scientists. So first of all, we commit $4.6 million annually through the university in terms of what we put into training the next generation of undergraduates as scientists and scholars and creative expressors, into graduate education and into faculty development. But you can also see, and those do include faculty-led grants from both private and federal foundations that amount to $38.5 million. That is just phenomenal that our faculty leaders are doing this work. And so what we do is recognize that those faculty are doing that work, including many of you in this room. But we can, Also, you can see that we have big new grants potentially coming in, not just for undergrads and graduate students, but also for faculty. And I can't announce because we haven't been awarded, but this opportunity could span VU and VUMC, which would be particularly exciting. What is the goal here? That we are a national leader in serving as the engine of transformation of higher education by diversifying higher education and by really creating a new tier of incredible, super high-powered, super visionary, and super impactful leaders. What else could we do as a university, and what is our vision for universities more broadly? You know that currently universities are under huge public scrutiny because the value of universities is increasingly really being, I think, reasonably challenged. Tuition is extremely high. Our selectivity means that many people feel excluded from higher education, and increasingly the language we use to talk about our research is increasingly specialized and may feel out of touch with where many communities are across the political spectrum. You see this in debates and discussions about whether to tax endowments. You see this in debates and discussions about our enrollment strategies. It's a really huge issue. We have recently had the wonderful joy, at least for me, it's been a high point of my career so far, to be able to launch a new initiative called Discovery Vanderbilt, which is specifically about catapulting Vanderbilt forward in terms of our national and global prominence for not only our research, but for how research can dramatically improve the state of the world. How can our work actually make a difference in the world? And that is a message that so many of you at Peabody are already fully inscribed into. That is not something that is new. But for many scholars in many fields, we have grown up in that strange bifurcation between basic or pure work and applied work, where somehow if the work has relevance to the world, it is somehow less rigorous. And I refuse to accept that dichotomy. It has never been personally true for my own scholarship. It has never been true for the scholarship that I really value of so many of my colleagues and peers. And it is definitely not true for the work that happens here at Vanderbilt. I think we are phenomenally well positioned to show that rigor and impact travel together and can actually be massively important to the world as we move forward. So a part of it is really a messaging campaign that I hope everyone here can help me carry forward, which is the power of big ideas. How can you, as a scholar, as a scientist, as a researcher, as a person with creative freedom to have new ideas and to create new knowledge, how can your work have the greatest impact? How can you do that in terms of training undergraduates? How can you do that in terms of training each other? How can you do that in terms of the work that you do in your research portfolio and in partnership with your community-based colleagues? We can think also about the impact that it has in terms of economic impact. I don't know if everyone here is aware, but research and innovation in universities is responsible for half of the United States economic growth since World War II. The inventions that we produce in this space actually generate jobs and economic growth in our city, in our region, in the nation. And we can think more productively and proactively about how to support you as faculty members if you're interested in pursuing that more entrepreneurial, and graduate students and undergrads in pursuing that more entrepreneurial sort of flavor of how to do your work. That's why we've put such a huge amount of money into the Wondery. It's why we're so proud of Dave Owens and all the work that he and his team are doing and want to pursue. What does Discovery Vanderbilt involve? It involves all units, so this is not something that's just restricted to the biomedical sciences. I want to be really, really clear about that we want to be just as proud about jazz musicians who go to Lincoln Center to be part of the Wynton Marsalis competition because of the way in which they are creating new knowledge through jazz composition, as we are for our NASA students, our engineering students who go to the NASA competition to win the rocket launch competition, right? Those both involve the two key principles that I want everyone to remember. One, the incredible excitement and joy of the creative freedom to create new knowledge, and the rigor and discipline that it takes to actually execute on that. That involves failure and involves success, and we're training each other and supporting each other in that creative freedom and in that rigor and discipline to actually make that scientific breakthrough real, or that creative breakthrough real after doing a lot of work. It's also building on two previous initiatives that many of you already know. Opportunity Vanderbilt, that really had phenomenal impact, not just on Vanderbilt, but I think on the nation by creating need-blind admissions here, really, really important, and brought a whole new cadre of students to Vanderbilt because they have the opportunity to be here rather than because of whether they have sufficient financial resource, because it's a need-blind admissions effort that is so well supported. Destination Vanderbilt, where we brought over 100 new faculty to Vanderbilt to really expand and strengthen the already amazing faculty that we already have here. Together, we have this tremendous corpus of new talent and energy that we can now really drive and support as we all move forward in Discovery Vanderbilt, this effort to really support research and innovation and transform higher education through the kinds of impact that our research can have. Why now? Just briefly to tell you, we already have a phenomenally productive and excited group of faculty, for example, who are submitting grants. How can we free up their time and mobilize and motivate those faculty who've maybe experienced one grant submission but a little bit of failure and need to get back in there, flipping the script that they're not grant worthy, but instead that they're absolutely grant getting, and how to put them in the position to be able to do that. We have tremendous amount of quote-unquote money on the table under the recent federal administration post-COVID. There is more money being put into research and innovation than I have ever seen in my lifetime and that I am likely to ever see. This kind of huge infusion of capital on the part of the federal government is one that we do not want to lose the opportunity to really be able to seize. And then lastly, there's the sense that grand challenges that are very dedicated to answering key problems or key questions in the real world might have felt out of the wheelhouse of some researchers in the past, that they were really based more in that model of pure research, but more and more of our faculty are poised to doing exactly this kind of the work. And Vanderbilt, with this tremendous amount of history of collaborative partnership with communities to co-create knowledge, is really positioned to be a prime leader in that space. Here are the mechanisms that we're using to fund Discovery Vanderbilt. I've talked a little bit about investments in undergraduate research through Immersion Vanderbilt, but many others, to really support that pipeline of undergraduate students experiencing research as exciting. Graduate student support that I've been announcing with my wonderful colleague, Vice Provost Christy Mizell, who has launched a really big investment in graduate and doctoral support in partnership with deans. But then you can see these other forms of support for faculty, including innovation and tech transfer, catalyst funding and support for proposal development, and cross-institutional institutes and centers to serve as catalysts. Where do we want to go? Well, I mentioned this notion of flipping the script on the sense of going after a big, bold initiative in a fiercely competitive way. That I don't strike people often as a poverty researcher, as a particularly competitive person, but I want to flip the script on that and see us institutionally as really going after a hugely outrageously objective, where before we were basically keeping it around a 4% growth rate in our research endeavor, in our research expenditure, which is our measure of how much research we do as a university. If we do that, we're essentially running to stay in place because all other universities are maintaining roughly that rate of growth. If we're moderately ambitious, we'd go after an 8% growth rate from $1 billion in research spend per year to $1.3 billion in research spend. If we were outrageously ambitious, we would go after a growth rate of 12%, which would be a $1.6 billion research spend in fiscal year 25. That should be both, daunting and super exciting, because that means all of us really gearing up to very creative, very innovative ways of being able to expand what we already do, and particularly to expand the impact of what we already do. In terms of social impact, I loved being able to think about what I mean by that frame. I mean it to include the randomized trial that was recently funded for one of our faculty members here in our reading interventions. I include people like Liz Zeigmeister and her team doing work on thinking about democracy versus autocracy in Central and South American nations. I think a lot about a project that I know that you are the inventor and creator and strategic developer of, which is STEM Sista Network, supporting Black female faculty in leadership roles in the professoriate, as well as things that we think of more in terms of standard innovation, like biomedical discovery. I will say that in thinking about these examples, I also want to thank everyone who put the work into this presentation. We need each of your leadership. We need each of you to generate new solutions, and we want to thank each of you who've contributed to this, including Jordan Moreno, who's sitting in the audience, who put together these slides. It's that kind of vision and contribution, everything from me being able to say, this is where we want to go, to you all saying back to me, I think this over here is where we want to go, and we shape that and co-create it in a vision of leadership that goes forward. So with that, I stand with you and for you in being able to support this powerful path for your own leadership and in flipping the script. Thank you. Okay, I think I have 7 minutes for questions. Yes?
So first, I wanted to applaud the EDI initiative for providing much better interactive data on the website than in the past. But one of the topics you identified throughout your talk that does not show up in our data is intersectionality, and particularly women. And so is that on the drawing board for data that, since it's obviously being tracked, that will be made available?
Yes. So what a great question. I think, Corbett, that of course I live intersectionally. I support all of our members who identify intersectionally. I don't know actually who doesn't identify intersectionally. And that said, it's kind of my experience of dealing with the, Office of, OMB? Office of Management and Budget, right? I would always be furious with census categories when I was analyzing data and furious with how inadequate they were, and recognizing that if I'm going to maintain anything that looks like trend line, for example, I have to relate to past data as well as think about future data. So that's the data answer. The real world answer is absolutely, and the leadership commitment answer is absolutely. Intersectionality is super important. And the ways that we want to think not in terms of slice and dice, but how do we represent multiple identities, and how can we speak both for our own ways of understanding outsider and insider status, and also make room for others that hold identities totally different than ours, I think is really important. I see a half hand. I see a hand there. The way in which students can build relationships with administrators, with leaders, yeah, with people in senior leadership roles in Central. There are a bunch of different ways that I would love to see increased communication and partnership and sharing of leadership and leadership practice in that space. One is just being invited to talk with leaders, particularly folks who've been elected into leadership roles, and understanding how that message or messages or questions or dialogue can channel in ways that are equitable. So one of the things that we face in my office is the challenge of which invitations to accept and which meetings to take, given that there's only so many hours in a day. And the way that we do that is by always being really open to and excited about meeting with students who are in elected office, because it expresses really clearly that person or those people have been chosen as representatives of constituencies, and therefore that's a really good way for us to go. So my door is the kind that I like to leave through to go to other meetings, to get out of. I joke a lot about how I like to be seen and to actually be walking the halls, to walk campus, to be out in campus as much as possible. So invite me, and let's discuss all the things that you would like to lead, and we can find really productive ways to do that. Great.
Provost Raver, you talked about when you went to Yale, I think, how that was a pretty different environment in terms of demonstrating, that you belong there, and this notion of like walking in your power and taking your power. The question I have for you is, where did you actually learn to do that? When I think about first generation college students, they don't know the nomenclature, the ways in which to operate in higher ed, and it's like, where do you actually learn how to do that? And then, like, how do you, it's such a challenge, because these types of spaces can make you feel, like you don't belong. What are you doing here? You are an imposter. But you said that you learned somehow how to, like, step into it. I don't know if that's the exact word you used. And it was resonating with me, like, you can't wait for people. You have to, like, show up and let them know, but you have to figure out how to do that. So if you were to give advice, how do we do that? Like, how do we learn how to take the power, walk in the power?
Yeah. No, it's a super, super important point, right? What's the first starting point to start to, so because, my field is specifically about how to regulate distress, right? The first thing that I notice, and because I'm really attuned to reading a room and to reading sort of everybody else's emotion, and as well as my own, I think the first thing is to recognize, oh, I'm feeling like this rising sense of tension, or this rising desire to talk, or this rising feeling that I'm being misread, and that's either making me stressed out or angry or something. And now, I very much recall this, giving myself enough patient compassion to say, I don't have to speak up every time, but I have to speak up once. And then pushing myself to, okay, I have to speak up once in the first 15 minutes. And then realizing, like, oh, if I'm struggling with it, Allison Marks, who grew up in Texas and didn't get to go to a private school the way I did, is dealing with it even more. So that, okay, now I'm going to cue her visually and make her by looking at her until she finally speaks. And then I'm going to affirm that she just did it, right? So I think it's recognizing it's not an all or nothing moment, but rather a building of kind of capacity to manage both my own dysregulating, discombobulating feeling, but with action, and then realizing, like, okay, it didn't actually turn out so terribly. Nothing horrible. There was, I'm not left, excruciatingly embarrassed at the end of the day. It was actually effective. Whenever I feel that, even now, in a group of provosts, I immediately think, oh, that's that old feeling, I gotta talk. even if it's something that's relatively modest in impact. So for what it's worth, that's how I managed it personally. How do you manage it? Any other advice?
How do I do it?
Yes.
You know, it is kind of what you said. You have to, how when you first started, how those faculty didn't see the things that you wanted to study and how you turned that into, you said innovation and like a way in which folks had to listen. You know, I don't walk in fear. I just go for it. And that doesn't mean that I've been successful every single time, but I've learned to do it even if I'm doing it afraid. And I think that sort of resonates.
Yes, I love that phrase. I've learned to do it even if I do it afraid. Yes, and I don't walk in fear, I just go for it. Yeah, I think, you know.
Even if it fails.
Even if it fails, right. And in fact, failure is instructive, right? Not knowing or being wrong, I've just learned something, right? It's actually helpful. So thank you, everyone. It's been a great evening. I hope you have a good future set of conversations that build on this one. Thanks.
Got the cue?
Yes.
So you can cue it up, Dwayne.
Okay.
So before you guys leave us, we have we want to thank everybody for coming. We also have a QR code, sorry, where we can get some feedback. So if you wouldn't mind taking your camera, where is it at? Oh, Lord.
This is why I'm not in IT.
You're supposed to put your camera on it, and it should bring up the survey. It's quick, fast, but we would love to collect some data.
See which computer it's on. Is it on this one?
I think it's on. It's on.
It is.
Yeah.
Isn't it on the desktop? There it is.
There you go.
Yay, it's there. Take the picture, y'all. I'm standing
Hang on.
by the door.
I'm making it square. See if the QR code will read in its shape.
Yeah, that's right.